Good afternoon. Welcome to the second panel of the Catholic University Law Review Symposium. This panel is about global environmental inequality. And well, in spite of being simply the moderator, I was asked to introduce myself. I am Álvaro Paul. I am a professor of the Catholic University in Chile, and I'm here as a visiting professor for this spring 2023. I hold a PhD from Trinity College Dublin and a master's in law from the University of Oxford. And I specialize in international law and human rights, and I guess that's the reason why I was invited to this symposium, even though I don't know much about the field. And well, here in this panel we have three distinguished guests. Well, their bios were pretty long, so if you want to know more about each one of our guests, you can just visit the symposium website. I'm just going to say a few things. Well, to my left, we have Hana Heineken. She is a senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. She obtained a BA in politics from Princeton University and her JD at Pace Law School. And she specialized in international and environmental law. Her work at the Center for International Environmental Law focuses primarily on holding financial institutions accountable for their climate impacts. And prior to joining the Center for International Environmental Law, she worked at the Rainforest Action Network. And in her job, she led to the adoption of precedent-setting policies by the largest banks in Japan, where she is originally from. Then we have Professor Lucia Silecchia. Probably most of you know her. She is a professor from the Columbus School of Law of the Catholic University of America, where she is currently the Associate Dean of Faculty Research. Professor Silecchia received her BA from Queen's College, CUNY, and her JD from Yale Law School. And since we are here at a law review symposium, I think I must tell that while she was in Yale, she served as a senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and current topics editor of the Yale Law and Policy Review. It's also interesting to know that in 2016, she began service as an expert to the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the UN, assisting on matters related to the elderly, people with disabilities, and ecology. And finally, we have Elissa Torres-Soto, a staff attorney of the Environmental Law Institute. She obtained her JD from the Catholic University of Puerto Rico and an LLM in Environmental and Energy Law from Georgetown University. Elissa's work at the Environmental Law Institute currently focuses on domestic and international projects, particularly on the Inter-American region. She works on a variety of issues, ranging from the mitigation of environmental, social, and economic impacts in the Peruvian Amazon to domestic environmental law and policy topics such as climate resiliency and environmental change. Well, now I'm going to turn the conversation to our guests so that they can introduce a little bit more of themselves and their work on environmental equality and share which are their specific interests on the matter. So we can begin with you, Hannah.
Sure.
Sorry.
Great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's I'm honored to be here. I thought it might be useful to just share how I came to work on environmental justice issues internationally as a lawyer. I have a bit of an unconventional path, but I think the aim of my sharing this is to just share that, to just let you know that if you are interested in this topic, there's a way to get there. And it may not be a straight path, mine was not. My interest in environmental justice issues intersecting with actually corporate accountability was from when I was in college. when, and this will date me, but the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, was a big issue at the time, and I was very much part of the protest, on-campus protest movements. And that experience really, for the first time, opened my eyes to the fact that public policies, especially those that I find to be completely unjust, are actually very much linked to corporate interests. And that was leading to environmental and social injustice outside of the US. And so all of those issues kind of intersected in my brain and really got me interested in the power of protest and how does that show up? How does that happen? Obviously, I was familiar with what was happening in the US. As Alvaro said, I grew up in Japan, and so I was interested in how has that happened in Japan. And so I went back to Japan. I was studying the protest movement. And one of the things that struck me was actually the issue of environmental pollution and how much that had led to protest, and which is, some people may be aware, there's a reputation that Japanese people are very quiet and says whatever the government tells them to do. But there's certain matters, like when you can't breathe the air that one is surrounded by and can't escape from, where you let your guard down and say, this is something that I'm going to fight for. And so that is what I encountered. I subsequently started working for legislators in Japan and was exposed to environmental policy, both domestic and internationally, and really started to think about the intersection of human rights and environment. And I think a lot of that was influenced also by being part of initiatives that were led by communities that were affected by these issues, particularly indigenous peoples. And so that was a profound influence on me. And prior to going to law school, where Professor Dunn was my my professor on a number of subjects, I had had the chance to work in Burma, in Myanmar, and that was one of the experiences I had was actually going to unintentionally going to a community that was Indian and Christian. Those groups are the most discriminated in Myanmar. And I was walking around meeting community members, and I realized that there was I don't know if this is the right term, but an open pit kind of landfill right next to their village, and it was humongous. You couldn't see the end of the waste, the hills of waste that were dumped there. And I walked in. I was looking around, and I encountered children who were picking the waste, and it was a very visual kind of, it emblazoned in me this understanding that environment and human rights, environmental justice, this has really this is at the core of humanity, and that is it really affects people. It affects people's lives, and that if we don't take care of the environment, that we cannot take care of people, and vice versa. And so I had the pleasure to go to Pace Law School and focus on these issues, but I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to do environmental justice. But because of my international background, I was able to kind of work at the UN, work with on international issues, including the hazardous waste trade, which is a whole other EJ issue. I worked for small island states on their on climate justice issues in terms of how they are losing their identity, their culture, because of the climate change being caused by others. And so that has that led me to actually work at my current organization, Center for International Environmental Law, for a short period of time, but I actually diverged from the legal path and I went to do strictly corporate accountability. And I worked on the legal logging trade, which some of you may know is extremely rife with corruption, land rights violations, and I think tax evasion and things like that. And then I turned my attention to finance. And when people think about finance, environmental justice issues are not the first thing that comes to mind. But in fact, my interest in finance came from the fact that, look, these companies that are causing harms, causing social and environmental harms, they are being they need money, they need capital in order to do what they are doing. And so there's someone there who is empowering them with that capital in order to, and permitting the harms that those companies are doing, and enabling that. And so that is why I went to turn my attention to financial institutions. I've done quite a bit of work on banks, investors, financial regulators, because this is, ultimately, if these enablers are able to see the injustice and to be prohibited from contributing to the injustice, then that means the companies, primarily the companies that are perpetrating this injustice, are not able to do that anymore. They don't have the capital to do that anymore. And so I may be going over time. A little bit. Okay.
We're very happy.
So I'll stop there. But yeah, I'm happy to speak a little bit more. I think my initial point, which is, I kind of I had a windy path. But there's many ways to get there. There's many ways to address the problem. And so happy to elaborate on anything I spoke about during this panel. Thank you.
It was only a couple of seconds.
Okay.
But, Lucia, could you tell us a little bit more about your work on the matter?
Sure, and before I start, it's just so good to see so many familiar faces, and I want to congratulate Laura you on picking such an interesting topic and looking at the domestic issues and the international issues, and the ways in which they're similar and also really different. And my first interest in environmental issues was in the domestic law. And where I started thinking about some of the international implications, sort of twofold. One is about 13, time goes fast, 13 years ago, the law school began a summer program in Rome focusing on international human rights. And since I taught domestic environmental law here, some of the classes I taught in those early years were about the connection between environmental law and human rights, which I hadn't really thought about in conjunction with each other all that much. And saw an interesting parallel. On the one hand, I think environmental problems are symptoms of human rights problems. And so there was that aspect of it, that human rights violations often will lead to environmental problems. But also the flip side was also true, that environmental violations can very directly cause human rights violations. So as both symptom and cause, I thought that was an interesting thing to explore. For example, the Declaration on human rights says everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security of person. And so there have been courts that have said that right to life and security of person is infringed on when there is an environmental intrusion into one's environment. Or the Article 25, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. There again, an environmental violation can go to that. So I thought looking at those connections first in that class really put that front and center on my thinking about it. But the other aspect of my interest, and the one that I focused on primarily, is the intersection between Catholic social thought and environmental justice questions. And I think that's a connection that is very close because the social thought on that has at its core a focus on human dignity, and many of the environmental justice questions we've been talking about are issues that arise precisely when human dignity is not respected. Three kind of experiences that helped me think that through. First, I participated in a conference in 2007 at the Vatican on climate change and development. And it was really interesting to see people gathered from all over the world to talk about these questions. And I'll never forget, there was one woman who was there representing several nations in Africa. And her presentation spoke very much to this question of participation. And she said that fairly recently, before this conference, there had been a group, very well-meaning, concerned about destruction of endangered species, and they had created a wildlife reserve not far from her home. Cordoned off property to preserve species from what were poaching and much illegal activity. She said, but what nobody realized was that this completely divided her community. So people from one side could not visit friends and relatives on the other side, that they could no longer use that land for hunting and foraging and activities that they needed. And it really made very clear to me the importance of participation and how often in our discussions we all have our own perspectives, biases, and limitations on that, and the importance of talking to people who really are affected not just by the problems, but by the solutions to that. And so I think that both the problems have a cost, so do some of the solutions. And I think her really heartfelt appeal to pay attention to people who are directly impacted will always stay with me. And the other has been, as Alvaro mentioned, I've been working since 2016 with the Holy See mission to the UN on a number of issues, and two of them are on the rights of the elderly and the rights of persons with disabilities. But I also work on some of the ecology issues, and what was assigned to me was to assist the Holy See delegation in its participation in the UN Forum on Forests. And so you take a city kid from New York and you give me forests in my portfolio. I know the tree in front of my house and the sidewalk box, and that was about it. So there was a learning curve. But I learned an awful lot about how the people and forests are so intimately connected. And so when we think about forests from a climate justice perspective, I think certainly they're getting a lot of attention now as being very important as one of the tools to deal with mitigating climate change, the importance of preserving old growth forests, the importance, as you mentioned, of deterring illegal logging and many of those activities, but also how many people around the world make their living from having safe and healthy forests, and whether it is manufacturing products, whether it is farming, whether it's hunting, whether it's planting. And so the connection of people to natural resources has become very apparent to me in that work. And then the third focus of my inquiry has just been kind of the academic research into what the Catholic tradition has said about environmental justice, human rights, the human person, and our relation to the environment. And certainly that got a lot of attention in 2015 when Pope Francis promulgated it, Laudato Si, but actually his three immediate predecessors really had a lot to say about that. And just a couple of things that I think struck out to me when I was doing research in this area over the past 10 or so years. In 1972, as many of you know, was the Stockholm Convention, and that was the first time that people gathered throughout the world to focus on environmental questions, or at least the largest scale up to that point. They came up with the Stockholm Declaration, which has guided much of environmental policy and much of our modern discussions. And Pope Paul VI wrote a letter to the delegation at that time, the delegations that were gathering there. And he talked about the tension and the challenge of environmental regulation, environmental justice, and human development. And he said in particular, development presents itself as the subject, the keystone of your deliberations, in which you pursue not only ecological equilibrium, but also a just equilibrium of prosperity between the centers of the industrialized world and their immense periphery. It would be unfair to refuse them, meaning the countries that were industrializing at the time, the means to a better future, in that they have often had to pay a heavy, undeserved contribution to the degradation and impoverishment of the common biological patrimony. And I think that issue, as it was framed 50 years ago, is what we're talking about today. And those comments were made in 1972, not long after the decolonization movement after World War II, but he was focusing very much on how those countries were often impoverished by rapid development in other countries, and how do we reconcile that so that we're not putting the burden of that specifically on those countries that have already borne the cost of that. Pope John Paul II, in 1990, issued a statement for the World Day of Peace, and he said something very interesting in that letter. He said the right to a safe environment is more insistently presented today as a right that must be included in an updated Charter of Human Rights. And so the Declaration of Human Rights does not mention explicitly the right to a safe environment, and that was something that he mentioned as a discrete, explicit right. And so in our discussions of the human rights framework, is that something that in and of itself is a discrete right? And he proposed it that way. He also mentioned that proper ecological balance will not be found without addressing structural forms of poverty that exist throughout the world. Again, that connection between environmental degradation and poverty. Pope Benedict, 20 years later, in 2010, issued his own World Day of Peace statement dealing with creation. And he titled it, "If you want to cultivate peace, protect creation." And if you want to read one thing that kind of summarizes Catholic social thought on the environment, it would be this. It's short, much shorter than an encyclical. It's like 8 to 10 pages. But a couple of things that I thought he pointed out was, again, talking about the connection and interconnection that's between economic problems, food security problems, environmental problems, and social problems, and seeing all of those related. He also spoke very much about intergenerational responsibility, which I think is a theme that we'll talk about a bit more. And then finally, Pope Francis's Laudato Si talked a great deal about the economy and how that might impact environmental justice concerns. And he also talked about 3 intertwined relationships: a relationship of humanity to God, relationship of humanity to each other, and of humanity to the natural environment. And the theme of that is, if we get one of those wrong, we will get all of them wrong. And so if we disregard our relationships with each other, that's going to result in environmental degradation. And I think that's a theme that we have seen and will see in the continued conversation. So I think both theoretically and academically, I found looking at those connections interesting, and I'm looking forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Elissa?
Hello, everyone. I'd just like to say that I'm in awe of both of you. As an early career professional myself, I don't, have the exposure you two had in your career. But I just like to say that my interest in environmental law started when I was in high school with the Deepwater Horizons bill. Like, I saw that on the news, and I was just wondering and seeing all the impacts to the wildlife that was there, and it just stuck with me. And I always knew that I just wanted to be a lawyer, and I pursued an undergrad degree in political science. And I remember asking my professor about, if there was a course on environmental law that I could take, and unfortunately there wasn't. Sadly, the professor had passed away just, before that semester started, and I couldn't. They hadn't gotten a new professor, and somehow I forgot my interest and my passion for environmental law topics. I did grew up in Puerto Rico, so surrounded by nature, beaches, the ocean, and I just always had that connection. But when I moved to, started my law school career, I really started diving into constitutional law, civil rights. I wanted to be a civil rights advocate, a civil rights lawyer. And when I was a 3L, Hurricane Maria happened in 2017. And that, honestly, that event changed my life. Because I always, conversations about climate change, and we're always, oh, this is happening, certain, this area is flooding, this destruction. But when it happened to me and my community, and I saw the impacts on not just the hurricane and living through that, but the lack of electricity for a month, lack of access to water, and what it did to my aunt who was in a home with elderly people, and lack of electricity, lack of water, people dying because they were trying to use the water from our streams that they were contaminated, and not having proper adequate health care. Um, People who were just incommunicated, who weren't, who were sick, where, like, first responders could not get to them. People who needed insulin and needed their insulin refrigerated but could not get refrigerated and died from that cause, not being able to get their medicine. So honestly, that changed my life. That event changed my life. And so I decided to just change paths and pursue a career in environmental law. Since I had a civil rights background in law school, I did an LLM at Georgetown University, as Alvaro mentioned earlier. I was, came in interested in pursuing a career in environmental justice, domestic environmental justice. But then I took an international human rights law course, and that also changed my life. And I remember reading Laudato Si when I was in undergrad, and it just Pope Francis' words just speaking to me and saying, like, I was, yes, agreeing with everything that he said, and feeling like you know that this passion that I yet did not understand, or try, even imagine that this could be a career that I could pursue. So then I started my LLM, my interest in international human rights law, and COVID happened, and that my career took a turn, definitely. When I graduated my LLM, I could not get a job, unfortunately. I really wanted to stay in DC because I saw DC as a great place to get exposure in this topic, but I had to go back home and figure out a new path, and so I got a job, a fellowship, a 1-year fellowship with Maryland Sea Grant, not dealing at all with international human rights. It was purely state law and ocean and coastal law issues. Nothing related to human rights law, but it was just my opportunity and my way of just kind of pivoting until I could get in a place, in a position, essentially, that could grant me that exposure to what I wanted to do, which is work with international human rights, and particularly in the Inter-American region. So I want to talk a little bit about, I don't want to monopolize time, but I want to talk about my role at the Environmental Law Institute. We are somewhat a different organization. We like to think of ourselves as a think and do tank, focused on three main topics: research, education, and also we have a publishing branch. So essentially, our mission is to think about these gray areas and foster innovative and practical solutions to emerging environmental justice topics in domestic and international law. We are not a very big organization, but we work in with a bunch of different topics. And part of my work, I still do some projects in environmental justice, domestic environmental justice. But part of my work focuses on the Inter-American region, particularly in the Amazon basin in Peru. Now we're a very project by project organization, so I had the opportunity to work in Peru in diverse topics. And since we're a non-partisan, non-advocacy organization, we work in policy. So the nerds of nerds of the law. We're like library rats. I had the opportunity to work on topics related to environmental defenders. We're now currently developing a project related to looking at how can Peru improve its legal, regulatory, and other mechanisms, land policy mechanisms, to really protect environmental offenders. Looking at doing a comparative analysis of other Latin American countries with similar systems and how what other countries, laws and policies they are developing, but also how they are being implemented, because implementation is always the key issue. I also had the opportunity to work with illegal gold mining, so identifying the vulnerabilities to corruption in the value chain of gold mining in the Amazon. So I was looking into from extraction all the way to commercialization, which is putting the gold on a ship and exporting it. Looking at what were the issues that were causing corruption in the gold value chain. What was it? Weak governance? Was it because there was a lack of capacity of the government, lack of resources? Was it the connection of gold mining with organized crime? Was it a lack of political will? Spoiler, all of the above. And then after we examined the problem, we really looked at what governance solutions could Peru implement to really tackle the issue of corruption regarding to gold mining. And I wanted to highlight also that these projects are very interesting because I get the opportunity to engage with just a wide range of stakeholders, people underground, really, doing the work and risking their lives to protect the environment. And it's just incredible. And because like we do not pretend as an organization based in DC that we have all the answers and all the solution. I mean, who are we to understand the problem that these communities are facing? As the previous panel was saying, like we cannot pretend, to know everything and to know all the issues that communities are facing. So it's important to work together with stakeholders. And I really enjoy, working with that diversity of people and really learning from them.
Okay, thank you very, very much to all of you for sharing your experiences. Is it working? Okay. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. It was very, very, very powerful to hear the vivid images that Hana portrayed, and also it was very